It was one of the most significant campaigns of the 20th century, and one of the most amazing physical feats ever attempted. Surrounded by hostile armies, 87,000 soldiers escaped and traveled nearly 6,000 miles on foot in just 1 year. It was a desperate retreat by the communist Red Chinese Army under Mao Zedong from the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Many say it was a brilliant military maneuver. Others claim that it was a series of strategic blunders. While the facts are sometimes elusive, most historians agree the human accomplishment was astounding. It was a tale of endurance against overwhelming odds. For the first time in the West, the survivors revealed the story as they saw it. It was a controversial event that not only changed China, but the rest of the world as well. April 1934, Jiangxi Province, China. Two armies were locked in intense combat. China's central government, the nationalists, had an overwhelming military advantage, and they were using it to surround and destroy their avowed enemy, the Chinese communists. On the verge of annihilation, the communist leaders were desperate for a solution. The story of what happened next has many sides. It is part legend, part mythology, and historians still debate the elusive facts. But on this they agree. The communist decision in 1934 changed the country of China forever. For the winners of this epic clash, the prize was immense. With the world's oldest sustained culture spanning over 4,000 years, this was a land steeped in mystery and tradition. In the 1920s, China was a sleeping world power, and its vast natural resources were barely tapped. 80% of its 450 million people were poor peasants who lived in the countryside. Of those, well over half owned no land. They often worked for little more than food from absentee landlords. At this time, China was a country in name only. Deeply fragmented, some of its states or provinces were governed by powerful warlords.
他所谓军阀呢，就是拥兵自重。他有一部分部队，在这3万人、5万人，他就不听中央的命令，他要自己为所欲为。
China's central government was run by the nationalists, who were also known by their Chinese name of Kuomintang. Their founder, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, overthrew the last emperor of China in 1911, with the promise to defeat the warlords and unify all of China. After Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, a well-educated soldier politician, Chiang Kai-shek, took control of the Nationalist Party. But rather than defeat all the warlords that controlled parts of the country, he kept alliances with many of them. The people most threatening to Chiang Kai-shek were the emerging communists. For years, young Chinese leaders were being groomed in the Soviet Union to implement the Russians' new system of government. Then they returned to China, and like the warlords, they established their own areas of government and power. Two of the most prominent figures in the movement were Zhou Enlai and a tall, charismatic young leader, Mao Zedong.
He was a very good speaker, and he would introduce humor and anecdote, and he had all kinds of language that appealed to the ordinary person, not just to the intellectuals.
By promising to give the property of China's wealthy landlords to the peasants, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai's party thrived in remote areas. By the early 1930s, the Reds had their own currency, educational system, and military army. Over 2.5 million Chinese people were under their control. The communists and the nationalists both wanted to unify China. But the nationalists also sought to preserve China's social order. They knew the communists aimed for nothing less than a total revolution, an uprising that would violently overthrow the upper class from its age-old position of power and prestige. For Chiang Kai-shek and his army of over 1 million men, the Reds were a force that had to be stopped. The battleground in the looming civil war between the Reds and the nationalists was immense. Rising out of the east, dominating the continent of Asia, China was a land of enormous contrasts. It had vast stretches of mountainous terrain, wide swaths of rich farmland, and some of the most extensive river systems in the world. By 1931, the communists had carved out several areas of influence in remote outlying territories. In Anhui province, the 4th Red Army was in charge, but its days in power there were numbered. In the south, Mao Zedong's 1st Red Army held tightly to much of Jiangxi province. Here, the army protected the key members of the Chinese Communist Party. Surrounding them on the map, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists controlled most of southern China, but their influence on ordinary Chinese peasants was far more limited. Chiang Kai-shek pursued the communists relentlessly and launched several major military assaults with the intent to annihilate Mao Zedong's army. But they were turned back each time. Mao's outnumbered forces prevailed with hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. The defeat seemed to make Chiang even more determined. On September 18, 1931, his forces were again closing in on Jiangxi province. This time, 300,000 men were marshaled to deliver a knockout blow. But on that day, China's fortune changed. Nearly 1,000 miles north, the Japanese Imperial Army invaded the northeast Chinese region of Manchuria. The untapped potential of China's natural resources had not gone unnoticed by Japan. The Japanese already occupied the island of Taiwan, all of the Korean peninsula, and some smaller parts of China that they kept after their war with Russia in 1905. While the Japanese rolled into northeast China, the world watched to see how Chiang Kai-shek would respond. The United States and Great Britain were determined to blunt the Japanese advance. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes were shipped to the nationalists. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was in a tenuous situation. The Japanese army was on the move in the north. The Red Army seemed firmly entrenched in the south. His American and British advisors pressured him to attack the Japanese. The decision Chiang announced to his staff was momentous. In May 1933, Chiang again set his sights on the 1st Red Army. To clear the way, he approved the Tonggu Truce, with a new Japanese-appointed government in the northeast. But Mao's men still won out, despite being outnumbered. But ironically, Mao's victories led some in Moscow to believe the Reds were capable of more than just ambush-style guerrilla warfare. When Mao rejected suggestions that he adopt more aggressive tactics, he offended several of his colleagues. In turn, they engineered a political coup.
毛泽东也被剥夺了这个领导权，苏维埃政府当个那个政府主席，当时他不是中革军委的主席，他是苏维埃政府的主席。
One of the key figures behind Mao's removal was a German named Otto Braun, one of the few Westerners in the Chinese Communist movement.
李德在苏联学到的一套作战方法呢，是一些城市战和阵地战的方法。
Otto Braun's ambitious military defense strategy called for the construction of blockhouses made of earth and wood to, as he put it, defend every inch of Red territory. In the meantime, Chiang Kai-shek was re-evaluating his offensive military tactics. With the approval of Germany's newly elected Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, senior Wehrmacht officer General Hans von Seeckt was dispatched to China to help Chiang with his 5th annihilation campaign. In December 1933, Chiang Kai-shek mobilized over 1 million men to blockade Jiangxi province with a series of defensive forts, trenches, and checkpoints. During the campaign, they constructed some 3,000 concrete reinforced blockhouses and pillboxes, allowing them to control virtually every road and path to the communist area. The strategy was successful. By the summer of 1934, the Reds lost 58% of their territory in Jiangxi province. Under Mao's strategy, when the nationalists advanced, they would retreat. Now the Reds tried to hold their ground. By October 1934, the Communists lost nearly 60,000 soldiers. Facing total destruction, the leaders of the First Red Army made a crucial decision: to escape with their entire army and begin what would become known as the Long March. But that was all they knew. In early October, the First Red Army secretly began recalling its men from the fighting front. However, there was much confusion. On October 17, 1934, the Red Army crossed the Yudu River. The Long March had begun. It would take them on an epic journey across China, fighting against enemy troops and hostile terrain every step of the way. It would become a major turning point of the revolution, and one of the defining moments in Chinese history. But for now, all the Reds knew was that they were marching into the unknown, and they faced almost certain destruction. October 1934. Following devastating losses to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, the Chinese Communists streamed out of their territory in Jiangxi province. This began one of the most significant events in modern China: the Long March. The formation of nearly 87,000 moved in two main columns to the west and to the south. The Reds were fortunate that the nationalists had even less information.
Well, it apparently took Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists 2 to 3 weeks to realize that the communists had really left. He couldn't count on some of the military units and the generals along the southern flank, and the communists were able to move out through there in pretty large columns because those guys were also, those leaders were hedging their bets. They didn't know who was going to win this war.
Between the two main protective columns, 15,000 party members, military leaders, and government administrators marched ahead. In this center group, Mao Zedong struggled ahead. He had come down with a severe case of malaria and was often carried on a stretcher. 26,000 other Reds who were badly wounded or too ill to walk were left behind to blend into the countryside. The Red Army started the Long March relatively well supplied with light weapons. Many of these were arms captured from the nationalists. They carried over 30,000 rifles, light machine guns, and heavy machine guns. Although the Reds had only 38 mortars, they hauled a store of almost 3,500 mortar shells. They also carried 75,000 hand grenades. Still, there was a notable lack of heavier weapons. The Communists did transport tons of other equipment.
They brought the whole apparatus to begin with that would allow them to run a government. They thought they were going to be in a place where they were the government, and the new government, the communist printing presses, the mints for the coinage, over and above the heavy military equipment.
The Reds had no boats or vehicles. Some senior commanders were supplied with horses, but the vast majority simply walked. At times, the length of the Red Army columns combined to stretch nearly 50 miles. In the meantime, among the Red leaders, the strategic goal of the retreat was still in dispute. Mao argued for a breakout from the Jiangxi pocket, followed by an attack by the Red Army on the nationalists from their rear. But this was rejected in favor of Otto Braun's idea for a full-scale retreat from Jiangxi, with a push westwards toward a communist stronghold in Hunan province. There, a number of smaller Red Army units had recently formed the Second Red Army. In late October 1934, the First Red Army came up against the southwest wall of the Guomindang blockade. On paper, the combined forces here numbered over 200,000 men. They were pre-positioned and in terrain that worked to their favor to stop the Reds. But the divided loyalties of the local commander, a warlord named Chen Jitang, served to undermine Chiang Kai-shek. The diplomatic efforts of the communists paid off. The Reds pushed the cork out of the bottle and streamed out of Jiangxi province. But as their army swung westward, they were attacked by the nationalists on the ground and from the air. The communists were particularly vulnerable to strafing attacks. They had no planes of their own, while the nationalists had between 200 and 300 aircraft. Even so, these aircraft posed a serious threat to the Red Army. To avoid air assaults, the Reds often moved at night. The communists assert they lost 30,000 men to battle, but some skeptics suggest that some of the early Red losses were due to desertions, illness, or exhaustion. Nonetheless, the medics were overwhelmed. In the meantime, a new obstacle loomed ahead, one that threatened to stop the Reds dead in their tracks: the mighty Siang River. Following its breakout from the Jiangxi pocket, the First Red Army marched westward. With the loss of radio contact and thus military direction from Moscow, the communist leaders were sharply divided.
当时李德、博古这些人呢，还是要坚持到湘西来会师，重新在那里的建根地啊，再重新干起。当时毛主席啊，没有军权的问题，毛主席考中不能到那边去，到那边去的话，那会全军覆没。
Mao thought they should instead swing far to southwest China to Sichuan province, where the well-armed Red Fourth Army had retreated. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek had amassed nearly 400,000 troops to block the Reds once and for all at the Siang River. On November 25, 1934, the Red Army threw its entire force against the river blockade. The battle was intense. Communists suffered heavy losses. The Reds' greatest predicament was their massive supply column. The printing presses, coin minting machines, typewriters, everything that slowed them down was tossed into the river. In the process, the communists lost almost all of their government records. After 8 days of savage fighting, the last of the Reds crossed the Siang River. In the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, little was known about the Red Army's fate after the Siang crossing. The world press largely assumed that they had been decisively beaten and that the communist movement in China would soon disappear. It was an impression that Chiang Kai-shek was only too happy to encourage. In the meantime, he hastily ordered his army to block the communists from joining with the Second Red Army. When the First Red Army's intelligence officers discovered this, the Reds swung west instead and easily captured the town of Zunyi on January 7, 1935. There they paused to rest and to care for the wounded that survived the massacre at the Siang River. The mounting death toll brought the brewing controversy about the Army's tactics into the open. On January 15, 1935, the Politburo of the Communist Party Central Committee held a secret meeting in the home of an ancient warlord. Seeing his chance, Mao argued it was time to return to his guerrilla-style tactics.
He believed in mobility, keeping troops moving. He believed in the offense, but not in gathering and gaining cities. He liked to be able to destroy forces. So he wanted to keep the forces moving. He wanted to be able to strike the enemy at their weakest points.
Mao understood that it wasn't necessary to win every battle to prevail. He was well read and was influenced by several ancient Chinese books. He argued that the most important role for a military commander was to preserve and strengthen his forces.
He read the Chinese military classics like Sunzi and Sun Bin. He read the literary classics that described battles of warriors and bandits and guerrillas, and took that and applied it to contemporary military action.
Many of Mao's comrades found this kind of thinking strange, even dangerous. But unlike most of these men, Mao had not traveled to Moscow to be indoctrinated in communist orthodoxy.
He had no foreign influence of any importance, apart from reading Karl Marx and some other communist books. So he was a kind of nationalist above all.
But he understood that maybe 80% of the Chinese populace was in the countryside and what their needs were and how they thought. The doctrinaire Bolsheviks stuck to the line. The peasants and the populace can't be organized, and the only way to win a war and to take over China was to work in the cities.
The Zunyi Conference went on for 3 days. Then Zhou Enlai, who shared command of the Red Army, shifted alliances and sided with Mao. Partly because of this, Mao emerged from the conference triumphant. He was given co-command of the Red Army and eventually promoted to chairman of the Communist Party.